There is one man who had an enormous impact on the soon-to-be godfather Vito Corleone, a man who actually introduced the Don into the criminal underworld and helped him build his billion-dollar empire, while also mentoring the Don's sons, Sonny and Michael Corleone. In The Godfather, one of the most important characters that is often overlooked is the jolly yet ruthless capo regime, Peter Clemenza. Peter Clemenza is undoubtedly one of the best characters in the Godfather trilogy, and maybe of all time. But many don't know the truth behind this character, and we still have a lot of questions. We don't know much about his rise, or even his death. Fortunately, we found quite a lot of backstory that will change how you view Clemenza. Many of you have been requesting this video, so join us as we answer all your questions and a lot more. But before that, make sure you join the Culture Mafia and like the video so you don't become a Fredo. Now, with that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Peter Clemenza was born in the province of Trapani in Sicily in 1889, and at a young age he had migrated to New York and settled in Hell's Kitchen. Peter had an older brother, Domenico, who remained in Sicily and who would actually become a Don a few years later. They would reunite, but under quite strange circumstances. But before all that, Clemenza's family struggled quite a bit. His father worked on the railways for almost nothing, and this would have a lasting influence on the young Clemenza. After slowly building a bit of a reputation for himself, he would befriend another like-minded young man called Salvatore Tessio. Both would work together, rising from low-level criminals and slowly becoming more and more ambitious. At that time, Clemenza had quite a suave yet ruthless reputation in the neighborhood. His ambition made him stand out from the rest, but this came with some unwanted repercussions. Don Fanucci, the local Don, had caught wind of Clemenza and Tessio's operations, and so offered them to work directly under him, but they ultimately refused. Clemenza, who was quite ambitious and so cunningly did not fall for that trap, Fanucci allowed it. However, they still had to pay the tax that he put on the entire neighborhood. But this was only the beginning for the young Clemenza. He would soon meet someone that would literally change his life forever. His rise. Late one night in 1917, Clemenza receives the word that the police are on their way to search his apartment. In his possession were a collection of stolen guns, which were worth quite a lot. Soon the police were knocking at his door, so Clemenza rushed to a window trying to get the attention of his neighbor. Once he found out that his neighbor was Italian, he threw him the blanket that contained the guns, told him to hang on to them for him. Later on, he would track down his neighbor, who turned out to be quite trustworthy. Soon, Clemenza would have Vito unintentionally commit his first crime. They developed a strong friendship and became business partners, and would actually become godfather to Vito's eldest son, Santino. Soon, Clemenza, Vito, and Tessio would work together and build quite an efficient criminal operation. Thanks to Vito's handling of Don Fanucci, they could now take over the neighborhood and soon the entire city. Olive Oil War. The Olive Oil War was one of the most vital turning points in the rise of Vito and his crew. This was when Vito went from a local mob don to establishing himself as the Godfather. The Olive Oil War is quite intense, and let's just say quite eventful. So if you want to find out more, let us know and we'll get into it. But the important thing to take away is that this is the first time their leadership would be tested. Vito benefited greatly from Clemenza's reputation and skills, introducing him to some useful people. They gave him the credibility to be able to build some very important connections throughout the streets of New York. By the end, Clemenza was now a capo regime and the most powerful crime family in the country, therefore making him one of the most powerful gangsters in the country. But where Clemenza truly excelled was acquiring talent. There are countless examples, but here's some of the most prominent ones. Rocco Lampone, Hyman Roth, Frankie Five Angels, and even Joey Zaza. I know what you're thinking, and yes, some of them would be a little too ambitious, but that's the treacherous reality of that world. Clemenza had hundreds of other button men under his direct control throughout the years and played an irreplaceable role in the family, having to complete quite a few important tasks in person. He was also a great mentor to Sonny and later Michael. In comparison to Tessio, Clemenza was not as good a war general or strategically effective. However, he was still just as ruthless and possessed better leadership skills. So now we're all caught up on the events prior to the first film, and so now I'm sure you know what happened next. We won't be going into these events in this video, but we do want to mention something that almost no one actually knows. The War of the Five Families. When Michael was set to return from Sicily, Clemenza was personally sent to Sicily to ensure everything went smoothly. You see, there was an entire complicated process that took place before Michael was able to return back safely. As you might have noticed, we mentioned earlier that Clemenza would reunite with his brother Domenico in somewhat unexpected circumstances. Those circumstances being that when Clemenza traveled to Sicily to meet with Michael, he met him at the home of his brother, Don Domenico, in Trapani. There's a lot more that went into this mission, but we'll have to get into that at a later time. But something that seems quite strange, especially, and many of us have been wondering, is why was it Tessio, not Clemenza, who ended up betraying the family? Who thought be the traitor. With Michael now the boss, it was quite clear both Clemenza and Tessio were not too happy. They always liked Michael and never had any ill will towards him, but the way Michael was running things just did not make sense to them. To add to that, they were promised by Vito that one day they could peacefully break off and form their own families, and now they want to cash in that favor. The one who is standing in their way is the Don's very own son. This was frustrating to say the least. Even Tom was not quite happy with how things were going. Vito nor Michael were oblivious to this fact, and since Vito was a realist, he understood that it was only a matter of time until one would betray. It really was the smart move to make. Even though he considered them like brothers and fought side by side for years, they would not show the same loyalty to his son, especially if it was in conflict with their own interests. Michael was even shocked. So the question now was, who was the one that was willing to destroy everything he helped build? And as you know, in the end, it was Tessio. But why did Tom Hagen always suspect Clemenza, going so far as to say,
I always thought it would have been Clemenza, not Tessio.
It's the smart move. Tessio was always smarter.
It actually stemmed back from when the first attempt was made on Don Vito, as it was Clemenza's regime that was in charge of security, and Paulie was one of Clemenza's top men, and so it reflected quite badly on him, which is why Sonny asked Clemenza to take out Paulie himself to prove his loyalty. Overall, it seemed that they viewed Tessio as the more quiet and reserved one, not as daring and rash as Clemenza. The suspicion was intensified during the first meeting that Michael was in charge. Clemenza was a lot more vocal in his protest against Michael's strategy. Tom probably noticed how frustrated Clemenza was, and so concluded he was the more obvious suspect. But Tessio's calm demeanor would have been due to the fact that he knew he would be okay in the end, since he would have struck a deal with Barzini to carve up a larger territory, or saw this as the sign he needed to switch sides. To him, at this point, Michael was a lost cause. He needed to make the move that would benefit him the most. But this actually began long before any of these events. Although we all see Clemenza as the jolly and just overall fun guy, as we mentioned, he was in fact incredibly ambitious and often went too far, to where the Don needed to intervene and rein him back in. Here's the thing, Tessio was by far a better war general, a better strategist compared to Clemenza, and a better player in the game of power. However, Clemenza was fiercely loyal and had no ambition to go past his current position if it meant he would betray those he considered family. Don't forget, he was godfather to Vito's eldest son and Michael's brother. Even though in that world treachery and betrayal are all too common, Clemenza was not the type to switch sides too easily. So it actually comes down to looking at the chessboard and making the best move. Vito knew this would be the best move someone in their position would make, and so warned Michael. Again, it's not personal, it's only business.
Tell Mike it was only business.
In the end, however, Clemenza would end up being the smarter one. Clemenza would become Michael's underboss and in charge of the Corleone operations in New York, even allowing him to move into the Corleone compound, becoming the second most powerful man in the Corleone family. He had now achieved all that he wanted from his youth: wealth, power, and respect. His death, how it happened. In 1958, at a local diner, Clemenza, who was cooking for his men, suddenly fell to the ground and suffered a heart attack. Now, the death of Clemenza is shrouded in mystery, and there are two reasons for this. There were some real-life events that influenced this decision, but first, let's understand how it happens in the film. At the time, the Corleone family basically ruled over New York with an iron fist. Michael was slowly distancing himself more and more from their criminal activities over there, and so it was up to Clemenza to keep things under control. As Michael had commenced negotiations with Hyman Roth, the Rosato brothers became more and more emboldened to make more and more ambitious demands from Clemenza. But wait, let's go back a bit and understand who the Rosato brothers were. Tony and Carmine were two gangsters who got their start working under Don Giuseppe Mariposa in the 1930s. However, later on they would fall under the protection of Peter Clemenza. Years later, when Clemenza was now running New York, the Rosato brothers and their crew were supposedly promised 3 territories in the Bronx by Clemenza. But it was clear that this newfound ambition did not appear out of nowhere. Someone had been in their ear and giving them this newly founded confidence. And as we mentioned, this coincided with the negotiations between Michael and Hyman Roth. And as I'm sure you're aware by now, Hyman Roth had no real intentions to work with Michael, rather using it as a ploy to distract him from his real plans. Therefore, Roth was trying to cause Michael as much disruptions and chaos as possible to weaken him enough so that when Roth's final blow would come, Michael would not be able to recover. So after the death of Clemenza, Roth began quite openly backing up the Rosato brothers, giving them the confidence, money, and manpower to detach themselves from the Corleone family and actually go up against them, a proxy war of sorts. So in the end, it doesn't seem Roth or the Rosato brothers had any direct involvement in the death of Clemenza, other than the fact that their whole skirmish was putting a lot of pressure and stress on the aging, and let's be honest, not the healthiest underboss around. But why did Willie Chichi say the famous line,
No, there was no honest.
There are a bunch of outlandish theories out there that try to answer this question, but most are too far-fetched. Here are the two possible answers, and this next part will give us a much better idea to the truth behind what really happened. Real reason. So let's get into the real reason behind the death of this iconic character. So why would a fascinating character like Clemenza, who played a huge role in Part 1, not appear in the sequel? Well, it's quite unfortunate, but here's what director Francis Coppola describes what happened. Coppola states that actor Richard Castellano wanted a friend of his to write his dialogue. Of course, from Coppola's perspective, that was not possible, and soon the negotiations fell out and Castellano pulled out. And well, here's how he solved this issue. Once negotiations broke down, and I just went back to the typewriter, and so I wrote a new character, Frankie Pentangeli, coming into the party with a black armband on his arm and saying, "Isn't it sad that Clemenza died?" And suddenly he just essentially converted Clemenza's character. That whole role of Frankie Pentangeli was written, of course, for Clemenza. So it seems that Frankie Five Angels was essentially a last-minute replacement for Clemenza, which means Clemenza would have been the one who would be in the courtroom against Michael. It's quite difficult to imagine The Godfather 2 without Frankie Five Angels, but the possibility of having someone like Clemenza, who was essentially Michael's early mentor, having to turn against the family he helped build, all the while we're also watching him build the family years prior with Vito, would definitely have been an intriguing and maybe even more powerful storyline. But at the same time, we wouldn't have enjoyed meeting Frankie and enjoying the excellent performance by Michael Gazzo. So it's hard to really know how it could have played out. But either way, we got an incredible sequel to the greatest film of all time. But comment below, let's discuss this and have a vote of which scenario you think would have been better. Real-life inspiration. Regardless, in the end, we got to see Clemenza leave a brilliant legacy and stay true to the code of Omerta. He was one of the few that actually remained loyal and did not betray the family. Peter Clemenza is undoubtedly one of the best characters in the Godfather trilogy, and maybe of all time. But did you know that, like many of the other fascinating characters in The Godfather, many real-life events had an immense influence on this character? The first being that Clemenza seems to be based on Frank Lobruzzo, who was one of the most loyal and high-ranking capos under mob boss Joseph Bonanno. Coincidentally, Castellano also portrayed Lobruzzo in another film called Honor Thy Father, which was released 1 year after The Godfather. During the baptism of fire, Clemenza was tasked with the assassination of Victor Strachey. This seems to have been inspired by the assassination attempt on mob boss Frank Costello, who was also shot in an elevator. The only difference being that in Costello's case, the bullet only grazed his head and would soon actually retire from his role as mob boss. Although we never got to see what and how Clemenza would have influenced the events of Godfather 2, his replacement, Frankie Five Angels, does fill the void quite well and is an incredible character in his own right, but we don't know much about Frankie. Yes, although he is a last-minute replacement, his origins and backstory is quite intriguing, and many of you have been asking a lot of questions surrounding the fate of Frankie Five Angels. So if it's something you want to learn more about, watch this video, and I also highly recommend that you watch this video next.